Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, I'm going to show how I use watercolor to add a print to fabric. This way I can create my own custom fabrics or my own little swatches that I can use in my slow stitching. I get to choose the colors, and because I'm using a stencil, I get to choose the shapes as well. So this would be really handy for a specific task, like for the holidays or for a particular color scheme. Now, watercolor has its own properties, and its basis is water, so you want to make sure that you use enough water to saturate your fabric, but not so much that it's wet and uncontrollable. So it might take a little bit of practice. And instead of a brush, I just use a makeup sponge because I like to pounce my pigment onto my fabric. This allows me to control the water level a little bit easier because when the water hits the fabric and the fibers, it will spread. You can control that somewhat by not using a very wet sponge. So it's trial and error. And it's interesting because the results aren't crisp, but they are quite beautiful. And the beauty of watercolor is you can mix colors to get whatever color you want, or blends of colors. In today's video, I'm going to show you just a simple gradient that I use that I pounce over a stencil. The stencil is just a simple stencil of all blocks, and so it creates an interesting result. I'll show you how I use it in my work, but the main focus of this video is actually on painting the fabric. So this is my process. So one trick when you're painting your fabric, if it's just that piece of fabric, and this is just a piece of muslin, if I want to make it a little stiffer, I'll just take a piece of freezer paper. I purchased this in a roll. And what makes it special is that one side is shiny and covered with wax, and the other is like parchment paper. So all I do is I take my fabric and I stick it on top of that shiny side, and then I just like to flip it over. So I want the good side of my fabric facing me, facing up, and then I put the shiny side of the freezer paper on the back of the fabric. And then I just iron it down with a hot iron. So what I'm doing is melting the wax so my paper sticks to my fabric. So it'll be warm to the touch initially, but it cools off pretty quickly. From there, I'll just trim off the paper with a pair of scissors, just so I don't have that excess paper hanging around. Again, that step is optional. Now, melting the wax onto the freezer paper is a temporary measure at best, but what it does is gives this fabric some body so that I can use it to print on. So now essentially this has just become my canvas. So then I have some inexpensive watercolors from a set, and I put them on a palette and diluted it with water. You can dilute it with whatever strength water you have. The more water you have, the lighter the color will be when dry, but it also is harder to work with. So I just have it, again, it's loose and the color is still pigmented and it moves around. I also have some makeup sponges, but you could use a brush as an applicator just as easily. What I like to do is take my stencil, and I like the simple stencils. This is just a bunch of blocks, little squares. And I start with my lightest color of pigment, and I dab it on the sponge, and as you can see, it's not sloppy. And I like to start on one side over here, and I just dab it on. Now I can go as detailed as I want to get an exact image through the stencil, but my purpose is just to get some shapes down here. I don't want to have too much water because the loose pigment will go underneath the stencil and be a little sloppy, but I want that image of those squares to show through. So then I like to go with my next color, my deepest color here, and I'll start at the other end, and I'm just dabbing that pigment on below. And I purposely chose colors on the color wheel so that when they blend, the yellow and the blue, I have a green. And that's the last color I'll put on my fabric. So I'm just pouncing, dabbing in an up and down motion. I don't have to get all of the fabric filled in. It's whatever I want to choose to do, and it can be as rustic as I like. And then I take that green just to help that blend along. And I'll come in here and overlap both the blue and the yellow. And that creates a little bit of a gradient appearance. I'm helping it along, so it's not a full gradient, but it gives the appearance of one. And again, I can just keep pouncing until I have the squares filled in that I like. Can add more water to my pigments if I want, but I'm quite happy with that. I'll go in here with a little more of the lighter version and just pounce a little more here, and then I'm almost done. So now when I have what I'm happy with colored in, I can just remove my stencil, and I have an interesting design. Because it's watercolor, it won't dry very stiff, and I can easily pull a needle through it if I wanted to. So I'm going to let this dry overnight, and then we'll come back and continue our work. Paper. Now, just to give you an idea of what happens after you're done painting, but while your fabric is still wet, when you have the freezer paper on the back, you have a little bit of a barrier, so it's a little more neat and organized. Here's a piece that I did without melting the wax on the freezer paper to my fabric. So as you can see, the pigment ran under the stencil in some areas more than others, and it became quite messy underneath. It bled through the freezer paper and kind of created more of a mess. So it's not the end of the world, the mess that it creates, but as you can see, it's a nicer look when you don't have that mess and you iron the freezer paper, adhering it temporarily to your fabric. So now my fabric with the paint has dried. I left it overnight. You only have to leave it a few hours. You just want to make sure it's thoroughly dry. Now, as it is, because I used a lot of pigment, if I rub my hand on the pigment, I might get a little transfer. This is dry, my skin is clean and dry, I don't get very much transfer, but if my skin was wet, it would reactivate the watercolor. If my skin was oily, say I had lotion or something on my hands, that might activate it too. So it doesn't necessarily have to be dripping wet hands. So what you want to do is try and heat set it somewhat. This will not guarantee no transfer, but it will help to set the ink into the fabric. So I just take my piece still on the backing of the freezer paper, and I put it down on my pressing mat, and I just have some parchment paper here just so my pressing mat doesn't get stained if there's any transfer. And then I just iron it, and I'll go over it, and I want to be on each section that has been painted for about 30 seconds. And this is the hot iron that the fabric can tolerate. And so I'll just go over all of this, trying to just set that heat. And I know that some of the colors tend to transfer and others don't. It really depends on the brand of watercolor you use, as well as the colors. Some colors really transfer. I find that blue and reds love to transfer. So if I use this in my slow stitching, I want to make sure the areas that I plan on using it in will stay dry. Then I'll flip my piece over again and just iron it one more time directly onto the parchment paper, which is covering the pigment. Now, if I had a bigger iron, it would go quicker. So with this technique, more is better than less. Once you've ironed it, just let it cool, and then you can remove the backing paper. So to do that, I just want to make sure this is nice and cool, there's no warmth. And then I just go to the end of the paper and just peel it off. And it comes off very nicely. And you can see the little transfer that occurred when I painted. So now I have some custom fabric. Because I used a stencil, I just get a simple image here, which I really like this grid. I find it's very useful for my stitching. I just wanted to give you some examples, but I'm sure you can imagine embellishing it just like you would any type of fabric. But here you have a specific image or specific colors, and that's the beauty of painting the fabric, is you get something very custom. So you can use your piece as a whole cloth, or you can cut it into strips so you get different pieces to use. And here I just took some little pieces and made some elements to use in my stitching. Over here I just continued with that gradient theme where I went from yellow to blue, and I echoed that with the stitching so you can really see that. And over here I just stitched around them, and then I added some interesting little found object to the top of each square. So I can use these pieces in my stitching. I'll store this with my fabric. I don't think it'll transfer, but if I was concerned about that, I would just store it in between sheets of parchment paper. So that's how I paint my fabric using watercolor. Now I choose watercolor because it's so simple and easy to find. It also doesn't require a lot of cleanup. The beauty of watercolor is when you put it on fabric, you can stitch through it. Some paints, like acrylics, really create a plastic coating, which you can't really stitch through without some modification. But with watercolor, you just need your iron and your watercolors. Have you used watercolor on fabric before? Comment below if you have or if this process intrigues you. And thank you for watching today. If you found this video helpful, it always helps me if you can give it a thumbs up. Take care.